Well, I think it's good to be up here again, having been back there for the last 3 years and sometime before that. It's a little different. And I appreciate getting to know Sarah these last 2 or 3 days and seeing her work. These young people are so intelligent, so capable, so organized that you have no doubt about the future of the church when someone like Sarah comes along and you see that she jumps right into the work and starts and don't have to ask anybody else for what to do, just gets the job done. And Sarah, thank you for helping me find out where I am. Things have changed in the last 2 years. I went up to the office area and my old office wasn't there anymore. They've changed it around, made 2 offices out of it, I think. And if you recall, the last time I preached here, the microphone wouldn't work. The battery was dead. And Andy came and brought me a hand mic, but I couldn't see my notes with the mic here, and if I took it away, then you couldn't hear me. So I hope today is better than that. When Don called and asked me if I would be of help on this day, I told him, "You sure you want me to come and make another big mess for you? After all, I haven't preached but once in 10 years. And he said, "Oh, you'll do all right. They're friends. They'll forgive you if you mess up." So we hope that that is the case today. Let us look today at the scripture passages from the book of Hebrews. This will be various verses from the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, and so you'll need to skip along with me as I skip along. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. Sort of like quantum physics, isn't it? By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners in the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. And then to the 39th verse. Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. The word of the Lord. Many of you are well familiar with the famous painting by Paul Gauguin in the latter part of the 19th century. It showed a picture of natives in the island of Tahiti in various stages of their life. There was a young couple over here with a small baby. There was a woman over here helping along an elderly woman, like perhaps her mother. There was an old man sitting over here on a stump or something, crouched over as if he realized that time was moving along on him. And in the middle, people were in various configurations of life. And the title of that painting was, "Where do we come from? What are we? What are we? And where are we going?" These are questions that are perennial questions for any of us that have to do with the meaning of life. We like to make connections. And when we make a connection with a new person, we want to ask them, "Well, where are you from?" Or else, if you're from the Deep South, "Who's your mama?" That's the kind of questions I've asked Sarah in the last 2 or 3 days, and finding out that she's from Oklahoma and graduated from Oklahoma State. And then she came to the great state of Texas to attend seminary, and she also got a master's degree from the University of Texas, so that makes her a Longhorn along with being a cowboy from Oklahoma State. Well, this got me to thinking. I didn't know too many people in Oklahoma, but I did have a date with a girl from Oklahoma in college. She was intelligent, attractive, jet black hair like she might have had some Indian blood in her DNA, and a little sassy. In that small town, there wasn't much to do but go to the local theater for a date and then maybe go out for a milkshake or a sundae afterwards. And so we did that. The name of the movie was one of those rip-roaring westerns called From Hell to Texas. She shrugged her shoulders and said, "What's the difference?" I don't think we had another date after that, and I don't recall her coming back to college the next year. Maybe Texas was just a little bit too much. But it also works the other way around. Now, Thelma, my wife, grew up in northeast Texas, a family of 10 children, about 15 miles from the Red River. 8 of those children were girls. We call them the Call Girls because that's their maiden name. But he would not allow any of his daughters to date one of those boys from Oklahoma across the river. So there was that suspicion of the boundaries that always tend to divide people and to keep people a little unsure of where they stand in life. Where do we come from? These are the questions we often ask. And genealogy is one of those exciting adventures in our time for a lot of people. I began that journey for me trying to find out where I came from after the series of Roots back in the 1970s. That was a long time ago. It was about the same time of the bicentennial of the United States also. And so I wanted to find out more. But Ancestry.com wasn't available then. Family Search of the LDS Church wasn't available then. So it was a long, hard process. But I found something about the families from both sides of the family that helped me understand who I am in the midst of the cosmos that's 13.7 billion years old. On the mother's side of the family, the name was James. It began in France in about 1154, where Guido de Jean was a French general of the French colonial army. And he accompanied Henry II to England to be crowned the King of England. Now that sounds like that's a long ways to go in that time, but that's like I did this morning crossing Lake Pontchartrain. It's not all that far to get over to England. But that's the way it was in those days. They moved backwards and forwards, and sometimes the King of France was also King of England and vice versa, and it got all mixed up over time. Guido de Jean's grandson, Geoffrey de Janes, as they began to be named in England, accompanied Baldwin, Count of Flanders, at the end of the 13th century, around 12th century, around 1200, on the Fourth Crusade. They were going to go take Jerusalem back from the pagans, but it got short-circuited. They decided to take Constantinople from the Eastern Orthodox Church, and so they battled Christians rather than going on to take Jerusalem from the Islamic people. But that family continues to this day in England because Guido was given a whole county of land because of his support for that king. And in 1637, a member of that family came to Plymouth, Massachusetts, of a group of people who landed there. The colony had been there since about 1620. And they came and stayed there for about 8 months, and then they went down and began the new colony of New Haven, Connecticut. And from there they grew up. They fought in the Revolutionary War and then moved west. On the other hand, about 4 years after the James people came to New England, there was a young man by the name of Johann Anderson, a boy, the ship's records show, came to Fort Christina in 1641 to the New Sweden colony. I had no idea that Sweden even had a colony in the U.S. It did not last for very long because in about 1655, the Dutch said, no, this is our land. We've already settled New Amsterdam and Pennsylvania, and this is our land, and you're not going to have it anymore. So out went the Swedes. But Johann Anderson stayed. His name became different because there were several Johann Andersons, a very common name. And so they began to use the nickname to tell which Johann Anderson it was. There was Johann Anderson the gunner. There was Johann Anderson the cook, Johann Anderson the smith, and Johann Anderson the Stalcup. Perhaps wore some kind of metal helmet in the army. And this Stalcup under the Dutch rule became known as Stalcup. Later on in English, it became Stalcup. Fort Christina, New Sweden, is now the city of Wilmington, Delaware. And I went and stayed one summer at the Hotel DuPont in downtown Wilmington, Delaware, that grand hotel. Looked out over downtown from the top of the building. This was once the Stalcup farm. And the new Old Swede Church, which was a part of Wilmington, still standing today, was built in 1698. The Stalcup family gave the land to erect that church on. It was a Lutheran church at the time. Gave part of the timbers for building the church and much of the labor for helping build the church. That church is still standing as one of the oldest structures continuously used in the United States. But that family was not known in Delaware after the Revolutionary War. They also migrated west. And then it wasn't until 300 years later that the James family and the Stalcup family met on the high plains of dusty West Texas. And in 1928, Johnny Herbert Stalcup married Lois Lee James, and their fourth son, about 10 years later, was named Bobby Lee, a good simple West Texas farm name. You got to have 3 syllables like Thelma Joe and Bobby Lee, Billie Jean. You've got to have that syncopation to it, you know. And so it is. 78 years later after that, we're gathered together in the city of New Orleans with that beautiful joy of life that we have known for these many years. After all, I've been in this area since 1978, so it's been fun. And the greatest fun has been a part of this congregation, a congregation that loves and accepts one another with all kinds of theological backgrounds and does wonderful mission for the city of New Orleans. And these leaders have helped change the life of New Orleans from the bottom to the top. It's been a grand journey, a grand story as a part of my story. And you have your story similar to that, each one of you. If you had the time, if you could find it, that story would be wonderful to know about where you came from. But there's a bigger story than even our own stories, our own genealogy. Ken Wilber, in his book Integral Spirituality, says, the history of the entire cosmos is the history of your own being and becoming. Our story goes back much further than 300 years in the United States. Our story goes back 13.7 billion years to the Big Bang, when something happened that began a process that continues to this day and is constantly changing and bringing new things into being. A singularity of critical mass exploded. How, we don't know. But it began immediately to expand and cool. You remember that old television ditty advertising jingle? Let's get together because it feels so right. I don't even know what they were advertising now, but it was a jingle back in those days. Well, that's what happened in the process of evolution from that Big Bang. Within 5 minutes, particles began to come together to form the nucleus of the neutrons and the protons of hydrogen and helium. But they had to wait 400,000 years of process before the electrons were united and began to spin around that nucleus to form atoms. And then it took a long time after that before those atoms began to form molecules. It took 9 billion years before a supernova exploded and spun off matter to form planets and moons and places like the Earth. 4.5 billion years ago, this Earth was formed from that stardust. And people like to say, oh, our bodies are made of stardust, and that's wonderful. But it's all those little particles from 13 billion years ago. They're still here in our bodies, in our lives now. This is a part of our story. 3.5 billion years ago, those megamolecules that formed in some way microscopic cells called life. If the Big Bang was let there be light, that process began immediately to be let there be life. Because they still don't know how that happened and cannot duplicate it in the laboratory. But we are here as a result of that one beginning of life 3.5 billion years ago. Now, beyond that story is another story which you've read about in the book of Hebrews today. The book of Hebrews tells a story of something going on in our lives that also has a history. Beyond the particles and the atoms and the molecules and the cells and the organisms and the brains and the neurons, all these unseen but vital elements of the dimension of life, something arose in that process that transcended but included all of these. And that was the element that we call spirit. That spirit that gave the ability to self-reflect on where we came from and who we are and where we're going. That at the very depths of our being, we can know and communicate with that unseen force that's been at the beginning and the whole process of time. And that synthesizing and integrating everything that we are today, and our response to it is called faith. The book of Hebrews, especially the chapter 11 and 12, is a faith genealogy. It begins with Abel. Remember Abel, the son of Abraham and Eve. Notice he didn't begin with Adam and Eve. That's just too bad. They were sinners, you know. So you begin with Abel, a person of faith. And then there was Enoch, who supposedly had so much faith that he didn't even die. He was just taken up by God. And then there was Abraham, who felt God calling him to go to a place that he didn't know where it was, but he followed God on that adventure to a new, strange land. And it said that Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And so that faith kept moving on from person to person and generation to generation through Moses, through Rahab, through the prophets. And then the book of Hebrews says, though they were attested by their faith, they did not receive what was promised because the process kept on going. But God had provided something better for them so that the end of their faith life was not the end of everything. It was the ongoing process that would not be perfected until we came along. And our process will not be perfected until others come along after us to help cover the mistakes that we've made. But what is this faith that we're looking at the history of in Hebrews? Well, Archie Bunker had a word for it in the 70s, purloining Mark Twain. He said, "Faith is believing what any fool knows ain't so." And there was a time in the history of Christianity where it seemed like the churches and all of the creeds tried to inject things that the more unreasonable or irrational it was, the more you had to have faith to believe it if you were going to be a part of the real history of faith. But faith is not believing something. Faith is not a statement. Faith is not a creed. Faith is not a confession. Faith is not 11 volumes of dogmatics. Faith is not a religion, although we hear about the Jewish faith and the Christian faith and the Islamic faith and the Hindu faith and the Buddhist faith and the Tao faith. All of these have often been called faiths, but that's not what they are. They're religions. Faith is the beginning of religion. Religion is carrying out what is a part of the people together. Theology is not faith. Theology is simply faith seeking understanding. Religions are those things where faith comes together in groups of people, forming confessions of faith, forming rituals, forming patterns, forming traditions. But religion is not faith. The Greek word for faith is pistis. And you look up the definition in a lexicon and you'll find that pistis has three main characteristics. One is humility. In the faith experience, humility is utmost. It's a recognition of need. God, I need help. God, I'm hungry for something more. God, I can't live by myself any longer. I need that which is transcendent to me. As the psalmist said, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. In another place, I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Another one, hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. This is the note of humility that is a part of faith, that is actually the beginning of faith. One of the most successful organizations in the world is the 12-step programs, where people come together and say, we had a problem, we couldn't fix it. We call upon a higher power to help us do what we cannot do ourselves. We admitted we were powerless, and we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves was needed. And we made a decision to turn over our lives to that power as we understood it. And that sense of humility is seen in the various postures of prayer in the various religions. It may be kneeling, as it has been in many Christian traditions. It may be lying prone on the floor, as the Islamic people do, because they are submitting in humility to Allah, which is just another word for God. Or it could be, as you see the pictures or the statues of the Eastern religions, the Buddhists, sitting in a lotus position with open hands, ready to receive the gift that they know that couldn't bring for themselves. Humility is the beginning of faith. The next part of it is openness. It's a willingness to search and to learn, to launch out on an adventure, to see what it is that I really need and reflect upon it, and then be willing to receive it. And the final one is the nature of trust. Trust is a commitment to that relationship which one discovers when one has received that gift. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Or as Paul said in Galatians or Ephesians, I've forgotten, For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God. You see the epitome of it in the life of Jesus himself. You see the humility at his baptism, where he comes to John, and who was baptizing sinners, and Jesus comes and says, John, I want you to baptize me. What? Me baptize you? I'm the one that needs to be baptized by you and not you by me. John, I need it. Would you do it for me? And so he did. Laid him down in the water as a sign of the dead life that Jesus was feeling, raising him up again to a new life that, like Abraham, he didn't know where he was going or where it was going to end. And in that ultimate trip into the wilderness, he exhibited the openness of possibilities of how that life should be lived. It's called temptation. It comes from an adversary that's trying to get us on the right track. And finally, at the end of his life, into your hands I commit my spirit. Wilfred Cantwell Smith was a great professor of world religions at Harvard. He was born in Canada, was ordained a Presbyterian minister in Pakistan. He taught at a college in Pakistan. Such brilliance of mind, he could read the Hindu scriptures in Sanskrit. He could read the Persian stories in Farsi. He could read the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew and the Christian scriptures in Greek. He could read the Quran in Arabic. He was that kind of scholar. And Wilfred Cantwell Smith said, as I have looked at all the religions, I have found in each one of them the same very attitude and orientations toward God or life as we find in the scriptures. Strange things happen on the way to the 21st century, though. The verb form of that particular noun is pisteuo. Means the same thing, except it's a verb form. But unfortunately, in the process of translation, it got translated believe, which gives more of a mental assent to a proposition than it does to the element of trust that Jesus was talking about it. And so, if we could translate it, we would translate it faithing something, but trust is a better word. Trust is a better word to use there. In fact, in the Gospel of John, faith is never a noun. It's always a verb. It's always something happening, something you respond to, something that is going on, not something that you reach out and grab and put it into your life. And so that experience of faith is different for each one of us. Just as our DNA is different, just as our family is different, just as our culture is different, just as our religious background is different. Some of us may experience that as a born-again experience. For others, it may be a slow, evolving process, becoming first one thing and then gradually moving to another. And how we express it is different too. It comes through our personalities, our psychological type. Some of us are introverts. We do well with that inner world of meditation. Others are extroverts and don't do so well, but boy, can they get a job done out in the world. Thinking and feeling people, some people are more rationally oriented. They need more propositions and laws and things like that. Others want to be more freewheeling in their thinking. All of these things, you see, faith comes with our name on it. I remember one lady in a church in New Mexico. Her name was Moselle. She came into my office one day, threw her Bible down on my desk, and broke into tears and said, "Tell me what I believe." Moselle was one of the hardest working people in the church. If there was a meal that needed to be taken care of for people coming to a funeral, she was the one that got the people together. If the church retreat cottage needed help, she, along with her husband, would go and take care of that. If ever was a job needed to be done, she was that Martha that went and got the job done. but she didn't know quite how to handle the questions that those Seventh-day Adventists asked her when they came by one day. And it almost tore her apart. But she was a kind, gentle soul, and her faith expressed itself in helping others. Now, as we look at the 21st century in which we live, we can look back and see that the book of Hebrews was written in difficult times. Probably after 70 A.D., when the temple was torn down by the Romans and destroyed. Jesus in this book was called high priest for the first time, indicating that probably the old priestly system of the Jewish religion is now gone and would be gone forever. People were being tortured because it had just been a short time since Nero had fiddled while Rome was burning and then blamed it on the Christians. Traditional politics and economics and religious patterns were going by the wayside. Some people were dropping out of the church, and the Hebrews was written to try to encourage them in their faith. Some were disillusioned because Jesus hadn't returned yet, as some had promised, and so they didn't know what to do. Today we have the same kinds of conflicts and problems going on. Stephen McIntosh, in his Integral Consciousness, said, "There is in the developed world today an increasingly bitter clash of worldviews wherein those stages of consciousness are battling for control of the laws and mores of their society. This cultural struggle is found not simply between liberals and conservatives, but in the developed world, we actually face a three-way conflict between the values of traditionalism, modernism, and postmodernism." It's all happening right now. All this conflict across the world, different ideas are merging. And Einstein said, we can't solve our problems with the thinking we used when we created them. It's going to take a higher level of consciousness. And faith may well be that doorway for us to see beyond the problems of the time, where old structures are not working and people are disillusioned and they're scared, where the atmospheric temperature is rising, filling the oceans deeper and deeper, and by the end of the century, they say there may be not too much of Louisiana, southern Louisiana left. Just this past week, I saw where the coral reef out in the Gulf is suddenly dying because of the increased temperature of the ocean. The psychic temperature also, because of the digital revolution, is creating a new level of consciousness that we don't know what we're going to deal with. All levels of life seem to be at a boiling point, signifying that a change is about to happen, but we don't know what it is. We're moving to a land that we're not sure of. Economic problems can be attributed to the population. The population has doubled in the world since 1970. Jobs are being taken away by the digital revolution at a fantastic pace. We don't know where to go. It's time to return to the kind of faith that is talked about in the book of Hebrews. Let us move on towards perfection, he says, leaving behind the old teachings, the instructions, the laying on of hands, the resurrection of the dead, eternal judgment. He said your views on these things don't matter. What's important is faith. Gandhi said we must become the change we want to see in the world. And that change we see in the writings of Paul. The fruits of the Spirit, the fruits of a life of faith is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Could we use some of that in today's world? If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit, the book of Hebrews says. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, or envying one another. If we do these things, we shall live, and we shall keep on with the process of life and pass it on to others who will perfect what we were not able to perfect, because we fulfilled the needs of faith in our lives, and then acted them out in the world. Amen.